This is supposed to be a very clever clip, and there's a plane passing overhead, and I'll try to start it in a very clever way, and we'll see what happens. You guys probably know the quote from Julius Caesar, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." So, friends, linguists, translators, lend me your ears. I come to bury folly, not to praise it. The mistranslations we commit live after us. The good are often turred with all our bones. So there you go. I tried, I think it worked. But there was a clever bit. I started with friends, and we're actually going to talk about false friends and true friends in translation and interpreting. And it is by rights a vital topic in all of bilingual communication, translation, and interpreting, because more mistranslations have happened because of false friends than I care to shake a stick at. So first, let's start with definitions, following the traditions of great Voltaire, Descartes, Socrates, name your favorite philosopher. What in the world are false friends? Well, think of Gollum from The Lord of the Rings. Think of Cypher from The Matrix, other traitors. They're obviously false friends. But that's not the kind of false friends that I'm talking about, because the linguistic false friends are not necessarily to blame. They are just words that exist blameless in the language. False friends are normally words in two different languages that sound very much, they're almost like homonyms across languages, but they mean very different things, or at least somewhat different things. They very often, not always, have the same etymology, the same root, the same derivation, but not always. Let's differentiate actually from another term, and I'm sorry, I might be looking at my cheat sheet here a little bit because I have a bunch of examples for you. So in this clip, I'll be a cheater, pumpkin eater. But let's differentiate them from actually another term called false cognates. And these two are often confused, and I think that the term false cognates is often used to represent false friends, except I don't agree with it. Why? Cognates are words that actually do for sure come from the same source. So I'm not sure why we would call them false, because false friends are very often true cognates. I hope I didn't confuse you. Let me just give you an example. Like between Russian and English, angina, angina is probably a true cognate. It comes from the same source, but it is a false friend. Or an example we'll take up later, intoxicated, intoxicado, is definitely a true cognate, but it is a false friend. But somehow or other, through whatever misperception, false cognates is also used. I prefer false friends. Okay, before we go into false friends, the world is not grim and bleak and dire. There are a lot of true friends in linguistics, and you should not shun them. Typically, they're like Greek, Latin, Indo-European words that do have the same meaning. I'll just give you a few examples. Poet in Russian, poet, in Spanish, poeta, right? Theater, concert, computer, many sciences, like pretty much all sciences, biology, philosophy, what have you, anatomy, they will be true friends. Many chemical elements, but there are exceptions. Many army ranks, many names of gems and so forth. I'll give you a funny example, actually. In Russian, malachite is malachit. Lazarite is lazarit. But this is a real example when a Russian delegation is presenting a present to the American delegation, and the guy says, "Это шкатулка, сделана из самшита," which is also, well, it's a type of wood. So luckily, the translator didn't say this jewelry box is made out of some shit. That would have sounded rather silly. And it's actually boxwood. So again, you have to be a thinking interpreter or translator. Another example, we're kind of already diving into it. Commander. We have the word in Russian, we have the word in English, except in English it can mean an army rank between lieutenant and captain, and it can also just in general mean the commander of the troops. Well, if we're just meaning the general meaning, the commander of the troops, then the Russian word командир works perfectly fine. But if we mean an army rank, it doesn't, because we actually don't have that same equivalent. And if we're talking about American or British armed forces, we would just use the American term. If I were talking to lay people, maybe I would just say captain and raise them in rank slightly. Okay, first, before we talk about false friends as such, let's actually take up a topic in one language and see how words can be misunderstood and why definitions are so crucial. Intense and intensive. Many people, even native speakers, might confuse these words. They're not the same. Intensive carries the connotation of time and like a rate per the time of something. Intensive course, intensive training means you did a lot in like little time, and intense usually just refers to force or effort and so forth. In some cases they are interchangeable. Magic, magical. Magical is usually, not always, used allegorically, like it was a magical evening, it was a magical date. Magic is usually used more literally, right? Like a magic wand, a magic tree, something or other. They can be interchangeable, they're not always. In fact, I remember an example when magic as a noun was literally translated in a Russian book, and it said something like, the science is pure magic. And it was actually translated literally as magia, but that makes, to me, it made no sense. It made it sound like that science was the practice of magic, which it is not. They should have just used the normal Russian word volshebstvo, because it also is used allegorically or figuratively. The idea, by the way, is not necessarily to give you like every false friend pair in all the languages. That would be impossible. I'll give you examples and then also hopefully a solution on how you get out of this trap or never fall into it in the first place. Fun and funny. I have a friend actually from Switzerland. She used to confuse these two words. She would say like, this was a very funny time tonight. It was a funny date. And I think she got this from ABBA, because I think in an interview or maybe even in a song, I heard him use funny instead of fun. Mayor and major. This could easily actually be misinterpreted from Russian. For example, the Russian military rank is mayor, and somebody who is not thinking could easily interpret it as mayor, where in fact it is major. And the Russian word for mayor is mer. And the Russian word major means a rich daddy's kid. So a lot of confusion which could possibly happen. By the way, there might be a term for that in English. I think I've heard it, but anyway. Sometimes just the fact of making something plural or singular could lead to a false friend. For example, in Russian we could say soviety as in pieces of advice or much advice, but in English you wouldn't say advices because it means something else. It means notifications, right? Like, send me your advices with your progress. It does not mean pieces of advice. You just say, I received much valuable advice from him, or many valuable pieces of advice. All right, that could easily be confused. An example from Russian. Hurdles and steeplechase is very, very similar in Russian. Although you can say steeplechase and just calque it from English, we also use бег с препятствиями, basically running with obstacles. But бег с барьерами, running with barriers, is hurdles. They're very easy to get confused. And also add to that obstacle course, which I don't think there's maybe an exact translation. I would just use a meaning translation for obstacle course, like соревнования с преодолением препятствий, for example. Okay, ingenuous, ingenious, very easy to confuse in English, right? One means like naive and not worldly, another means brilliant. Genial, congenial. This is actually a very interesting pair of words, because in two definitions, actually I'm not even going to tell you, but look them up, especially in Merriam-Webster, do this little experiment, and they coincide in two definitions, and then they branch and fork out in the third definition. So those two can easily be confused. What's the point? You know, you're like, Vladimir, what's the point? You promised to talk to me about false friends. Well, these are sort of like false friends in one language. And if they can get confused in one language, they can absolutely, definitely get confused between two languages. By the way, definitely, definitively, two different words. Okay, let's talk now about false friends as such between different languages. And I already mentioned angina and angina. In Russian, angina means tonsillitis. In English, it means quite something different, like a precursor to a heart attack, right? But between Spanish and English, it is a true friend. My guess, I don't remember the etymology, it must come from something like pressure, maybe, I'm not sure. All right, next example. This is actually a real example that happened to me even in the name of a book. Not to me, but you know, I observed it. But it's a very interesting word. Adequate, adekvatny, adecuado in Spanish. In English, obviously, adequate means just barely sufficient. You know, like the food was adequate, the interpreter was adequate. Hopefully, that's never said about any living interpreter, not about you or me. Right? In Russian, it means something totally different. It means fitting and suitable to the situation, like adekvatny ответ, a reasonable or a sensible or a fitting answer, like a sequitur answer. And it came to mean, you can also use it about people. That sort of evolved. And if you say adekvatny человек, you mean sensible, again, reasonable, coherent, and so forth. And in Spanish as well, adecuado. Well, between Spanish and Russian, it is not so much of a false friend because it also means appropriate or fitting. But in English, it means something different. There was a book in Russian called Adekvatnost, and I don't actually know what they named the book in English because I offered, but I was not the project leader. But I know that even before they had the book translation, the website was called Adequacy. And I told the guy, who was actually a translator by education, I said, this isn't going to fly because it's a completely different meaning. And actually, curiously, the name I offered, and you'll be like, what the heck? But the name I offered is Poison Reason. And before you stop the video and completely shun me, listen out to this rationale. First of all, it's the same number of syllables, which doesn't necessarily matter, but because the name of the book, the title is so rhythmic, Adekvatnost, poison, reason, it kind of gives that interesting ring to it. Plus, it conveys the meaning, because that's basically what the author is talking about. I read the book, obviously, at least to a large extent, before offering this meaning. He is talking about that. Plus, it lends itself to a cute joke in the introduction or somewhere in the book. Poison reason or poisoned reason. Anyway, let's move on. German and English. Gift and gift. In English, gift is obviously a present. In German, gift means poison. This must have come from some Parisian court intrigues where the best gift was poison or vice versa. I don't know. But curiously, I do not think that these words are cognates. I think they come from different sources. Also, between German and English, See and See. In German, der See is a lake. In English, it is a sea. Similar, but different, right? Aggressive and ambitious. These are things that are very easy to confuse if you're not thinking as you're interpreting, which is sometimes good and sometimes bad. But in Russian, for example, aggressivny is always violent, is always bad. In English, sort of, but not always, like aggressive sales or an aggressive approach, or you want to be more aggressive about this or that. It's not necessarily always good, but it doesn't carry with it that bad of a connotation. It can be used positively. Same with ambitious. Like in English, ambitious is actually a good thing, except remember the quote from Mark Antony. He does use it in a bad way, but that's like Shakespeare in English. He says, the noble Brutus has told you Caesar was ambitious. If it were so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously has he suffered it. So he is using it in the same way that it is used in Russian, like ambitious as in walking over people's heads. But that's not the way it is used in modern English. It's actually a good word for the most part, right? Okay, this is really funny. A real life example. Advocata, aguacate. In Spanish, aguacate is, of course, the fruit avocado. But in Russian, advocata is the genitive case of lawyer, advocat. Actually, I'm sorry, it's the accusative case. See? So one time, a friend of mine, I shouldn't mention any names, Jose, says to me in Russian, and Jose is completely brilliant in English and Spanish, but his Russian could use a little brushing up. And he says, "На завтрак мне нравится есть адвоката." And what he wanted to say is he enjoys eating avocados for breakfast, but what he actually says is he enjoys eating lawyers for breakfast. So he probably is a good prosecutor, except he's not. Okay, this is also from a book. This is from a book called Invasion, Вторжение, that we translated by a Ukrainian author who wrote in Russian about the events of the war. And one of the key, very often used words was occupante. And the translator translated as occupants. And I'm very glad that the editor actually caught it, and he was like, no, she means occupiers, not occupants, right? We'll talk about this later, but if ever in doubt, just use a different word. Just use a synonym, aggressors, invaders, and so forth. And we're going to, in a second, get to the solution. And just really, really quick, people don't often talk about this, but in my book, there are also false friends of style. No, actually, before false friends of style, there are friends that are sometimes true friends and sometimes false friends. Like, for example, I think I missed it because I couldn't see it, but the word artist between Russian and English, sometimes it is a true friend, but sometimes it is a false friend, because in English, artist refers to anybody who does any kind of art. In Russian, it refers to performers, mainly, like musicians or like theater actors. So it is not always a true friend. Plus, we would, for example, say in Russian, artist circa, but in English, I wouldn't go with like circus artist. I would go with circus performer, probably. So just keep that in mind, that in many cases they may be a true friend in one definition, a false friend in another. Okay, what about false friends of style, commonality, and register? I'll give you a few examples. Semantically or meaning-wise, words might mean the same thing. Like, for example, in English, communication or collaboration are very beautiful, normal, everyday words. But in Russian, because they're borrowed words, komunikatsiya, collaboratsiya, would make the speech or the text sound stilted and bureaucratic, because we have the same equivalents in Russian, which are not communication and collaboration. And another one, which is sort of register, but also commonality. For example, in Russian, we call the university department fakultet. In English, it is a valid definition, but I think it's either very British or very rare. Like, you could call a university department a faculty, but that would be strange and unusual, because usually faculty refers to the staff. So keep this in mind. Yeah, another false friend of style is the English present, the Russian present. If you say present in Russian, you sound like you're from the 19th century or trying to sound smart. Okay, let's wrap up, because we kind of have to listen to the sun and to the moon and so forth. The main thing is not what they are, but the solution. And hopefully I can read my very clever solutions, but the main solution is know the definitions, because if you know the definitions, you will differentiate between them, right? It's been said that differentiation is a mark of like reason, sanity, and so forth. Complete identification is no good. So if you know the nuances of each word in each of the languages, you just won't get confused. In translation, there is no excuse, because you have all the time in the world to actually look up these definitions, or maybe not all the time, but almost. In interpreting, this is my rule of thumb. If I'm very, very sure, like 95 or higher % sure that it's a true friend, I'll roll with it. If I'm not sure, I'm just going to use a synonym or maybe just a meaning interpretation or something of the sort. So that's basically what I would go with. So false friends, quick recap. They're words between two or more languages that sound the same, do not mean the same thing, not necessarily always. And avoiding the trap consists basically in understanding what each of them is, and then if it's a true friend, using it, and if it's a false friend, not. The last thing is avoid the pendulum effect. I have one colleague who is an extremely good translator, and he told me one funny thing. When he was learning English, he put the definite article everywhere, and then his teacher told him, you're overusing the definite article, so to avoid the error, he stopped using it altogether. That's what we call the pendulum effect. So you don't want to get into the pendulum effect and never, ever, ever use true friends, because they exist. And here, let me end with this clever thing. In translation, in linguistics, and in life, the true friends way outnumber the false friends. So it is very important to just know the true from the false, and then you're all set, and everything is hunky-dory. And that's the way the cookie crumbles, to quote Jim Carrey, and that's the end of the clip. The moon is above us, and I need a run and a glass of wine, and I'll see you guys in the next clip.